Hello, Juniper Owens here, Director of the Academy of Integrative Mental Health, and your host for today's episode, which is very special to me as both a human and mental health professional that has been affected by substance use disorder. In fact, in 2017, the Pew Research Center reported that nearly half of all Americans have a family member or close friend who struggled with addiction. Both of my sons struggled with substance misuse. One of my sons lost his battle and died in March of 2022 due to an overdose involving fentanyl, and my other son had a near fatal overdose shortly after. Over the last 8 years of parenting children with substance use disorder and grieving a substance-related loss, I have experienced and learned much about the stigma, isolation, and trauma that family and friends experience when loving a person with substance misuse. As a mental health professional, I felt even more shame that I didn't have the tools to help myself or magically help my kids get sober or safe or into recovery. Everything changed for me when I found the Invitation to Change model. The Invitation to Change approach is a holistic helping framework based in science and kindness, designed for the families and loved ones of people struggling with substance use, as well as the professionals who support them. The training and materials invite you to reflect on what it means to help, reimagine the role that loved ones can play in the change process, and learn evidence-supported strategies for helping. According to a paper published in the Journal of Social Work Public Health, individuals with substance use disorders cannot be understood and treated effectively without considering the impact on the whole family. Addiction researchers have confirmed the reciprocal relationship between the disease of addiction and the environment. All persons influence their social environment and in turn are influenced by it. The family system must be factored into the understanding of the disease development and maintenance, as well as be included in the efforts necessary for successful ongoing treatment. The Invitation to Change is made up of 3 main parts: helping with understanding, helping with awareness, and helping with action. At the center of it all is practice, because learning a new behavior can't happen without it. Invitation to Change utilizes CRAFT, Community Reinforcement Approach to Family Training, which originated at the University of New Mexico, developed by Dr. Robert Myers and colleagues. Research on CRAFT shows that 70% of families who received CRAFT are able to help their loved ones start treatment within a year. Those are some really good stats. But also, CRAFT helps family members improve their own lives, whether their loved one ends up seeking treatment or not. Heather Ross, a parent coach trained and certified in both Invitation to Change and CRAFT, and host of Living with Your Child's Addiction podcast, is our guest today and will be sharing her personal experience with her daughter using these methods. Full disclosure, I have been learning from Heather for the last few months as my coach, and the work has completely transformed my relationship with myself and with my living son, as well as my complicated and traumatic grief. I'm honored to share this conversation with you today, and it is my sincere hope that you are able to offer this resource to a client or find it helpful in your own life. Heather, thank you so much for being here today, and I'm so excited to talk all about the work that you do and CRAFT and Invitation to Change. So welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me today.
And I'd love for you to just go ahead and introduce yourself to our listeners.
Well, my name's Heather Ross, and I'm a parent coach. I'm craft trained, and I'm also certified in the Invitation to Change approach. And I do this work because of my daughter, Helena. I used to be a corporate controller. I thought that I would do that work forever. I had no interest in doing anything else. But then when my daughter started struggling with substance use, which started when she was around 12 years old, I didn't really know about it until she was like maybe 15. And that's when I started getting calls from the school, calls from the police, and noticing, all these things started happening at once. Like she was struggling with depression, she was struggling with self-harm, an eating disorder, and then several different substances. So I felt like I was playing this game whack-a-mole. Like once I would address one thing, then one of the other things she was struggling with would get worse. And it was, as a mom, it was so overwhelming to see my daughter changing that fast and to not be able to help her. Like it was the first thing in my life that I experienced that I couldn't just fix, right? Or I couldn't like outwork it. And the same thing with as a mom, even, it was the first thing that came up that I couldn't really help her through. And so I felt very helpless and powerless and frustrated. And I took her to every professional that I could possibly find. And a lot of what we were told to do, or what I was told to do, would kind of fall along the lines of tough love. I wasn't really given a lot of education about addiction. I did so much research on my own. When I couldn't sleep at night, I was just up all night Googling, and I couldn't find anything that told me what to do when my daughter didn't want to change. She didn't want to stop using substances. All I could find was what you should do when they're ready to get help and go to treatment. And so, again, it just led to this powerlessness and me doing things from a place of fear and anger and trying to control her substance use, which just led to rebellion in her. So she was running away constantly. There was so much chaos in our home, and things were getting more and more out of control. And so eventually I got to this point where I was really struggling as well. My health was really I ended up with pneumonia. Like I just could not get better. I was working a lot also just to kind of avoid being at home because I didn't know what to do anymore. And so I decided to do something that felt really wrong and against everything that I had learned, but I just stopped doing everything because I stopped taking her to every doctor. I stopped, just trying to force all of these solutions, and decided that we all just needed a little space to figure out our next move, because that's the thing that I wasn't really leaving any space to figure things out. I was just like this action machine doing one thing after the other. And in that space, thank God, I started focusing on myself, and I started working with a coach for weight loss, to kind of work on my health, because I wasn't even taking care of my most basic needs. I wasn't sleeping. I wasn't eating anything healthy. I wasn't moving my body. I wasn't even like drinking enough water. My hair was falling out. I mean, all these things were going wrong with my health. So I took the microscope off my daughter and started focusing on myself and working with a coach, because I also didn't, think anything would ever help us. So I'd kind of given up in some ways too. And what I discovered working with that coach was that focusing on myself actually could help my relationship with my daughter. And around that time, I also found the book Beyond Addiction: How Science and Kindness Help People Change, which is written by some of the psychologists at CMC Foundation for Change. And a lot of what's in that book is based on CRAFT, which is community reinforcement and family training. And I started implementing that as well. So I was doing two things at the same time. One, I was really focusing on myself. And the other thing I was doing was using what I had learned from this book about craft to support my daughter, which really changed my approach to one that really aligned with me as a mom and my values, because my fear and my belief in kind of the tough love approach being the only way that I could help my daughter, I had departed from my values, and I wasn't feeling good about myself, how I was showing up as a mom at all. And I suddenly felt really good that I could support my daughter in a way that felt good. It was loving, it was compassionate, and I knew that there was science behind it. And so she really started changing. Our relationship was repaired. And even though she was still actively using substances, even though her addiction had really escalated by this point, she was around 18 years old, 17, early 18 when I started using craft. But throughout the next year, I started seeing a lot of changes in here and her being more curious about recovery and trying different things, experimenting on her own. And I was giving her the space to do that because I also moved from this belief system where absolute abstinence forever is the only acceptable thing, and was giving her space to figure out how to get in recovery her own way. I let go of that one size fits all approach. And she ended up she went to treatment a couple of times. After the second time, just like her light came back on. She was really working hard on building a life as a young woman in recovery. She was 21 years old at the time, and we were getting to have that more normal mother-daughter relationship where I just got to enjoy her presence and enjoy the peace in our relationship, and we were just getting to spend so much more time together. She was more available for a relationship, and so I was, like, in my glory because I also really appreciated my time with her a lot more at that point because I had lost a lot of that. She wasn't very available when she was, deep in her addiction. I was taking what I could get, but now I was finally having what I had been working so hard for. And about she was several, like 18 months into mostly being in recovery, and she started really having some struggles in her sober living home. There was a lot of things that happened that made her feel really unsafe and unstable. And she ended up having a reoccurrence of use, and she was given fentanyl. She ended up getting like 4 times the lethal amount, and she ended up passing away from that reoccurrence of use. And it was really it would have been devastating at any time, but it seemed especially devastating to finally have so much hope about the future and to feel like I had finally figured things out and done everything right to support her. And also, there was the grief for the time that was lost during those like 5 years when I was, using tough love and not really supporting her in the way that she needed, and seeing how fast things change. And I have to wonder if things would be different had I found, an evidence-based, science-based kindness approach to support her sooner. And I think that there's two things about my story that are also really important that I really just want to make sure that everybody hears. And one is that we were able to repair our relationship, even though she was in active addiction still. And I think a lot of times people feel like healing can't happen, but healing was happening for both of us, even though she was still actively using substances and really struggling. And the other part of that is that because I was willing to work on myself so hard, and I never gave up on looking for a way to support her, that it had been years since we'd even had any kind of disagreement. And our last conversation, where she called me to tell me that she, had a reoccurrence of use and had to move out of her sober living home, it was just very loving and supportive and solution focused. And that was the last conversation that I ever had with her. And so many parents have regrets about their last interactions with their kids. And because of me being willing to work on myself and knowing the importance of that, I don't have to live with that regret.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, first, Heather, thank you for sharing your story. What you have shared really mirrors a lot of the other stories that we and I have heard from other parents and other people with loved ones struggling with substance use disorder or substance dependence. And obviously, my heart just melts and breaks apart into a million pieces, both hearing the grief of your daughter, but also the grief over the years of not knowing about this, or of only having a little bit of knowledge and how to approach her substance use, which I think also mirrors a lot of people's experience, and even my own, with also having children with substance use disorder. And like the you mentioned a few things that I really want to bring up, and I think they're really great starting points for this conversation. And one of them is some of the approaches that you were familiar with that didn't resonate with you. And I know that that's the same experience I had, and that's the same experience that a lot of other family members that I talk to, it just is not working for them or their child or the relationship with their child or loved one. And I think it really adds to the already difficult, stressful, and let us say traumatic experience that it is to witness your baby, your sweet little baby that we like took to the park and put shoes on and like had all these dreams for, and then witnessing them in that pain and suffering of addiction. And so, like, I kind of want to start there, if that's okay, with let's start with what's the traditional. We all know Al-Anon and AA, and we're not against that necessarily. You and I have both been to many of those meetings before in the past. And like, so some of the traditional things, like for example, tough love, or some of the approaches that I knew about, were to just wait until they hit rock bottom, to tell them no, like basically anything you did for your loved one was enabling. I'm talking, even if I gave them a hug, felt like in some of my interactions that it was enabling. And so I really would like to kind of go over some of these, like the main kind of more traditional ways of looking at loving someone with substance use disorder, and then maybe some of the ways that craft an invitation to change, what their approach is. That's a big question.
Yeah, I was just going to say, where do I start with that? I think I'll start with the enabling piece, because that's such an overused, shaming and fear inciting word. You know, the last thing that any parent wants to hear is that they're enabling, because of all of the stigmas that go along with that word. And I find when I'm working with somebody, the fear of enabling is like a roadblock. It keeps them feeling paralyzed with fear. They can't move, they can't make any decisions, because every single thing that they want to do feels wrong. And that was, I have to say, no matter how hard I work, it's one of the hardest things for me still to overcome, right? Like when I'm sharing things with people, I still get this like feeling in my stomach like I'm doing something wrong, even though I've learned and read the studies and I know that what I'm sharing isn't wrong, but I'm so conditioned, you know, for so many years, and I've only known this information for a couple of years, and it was still even there with my daughter at the end, the fear of doing too much. I've never wished that I did less. I've only wished that I did more. You know, one of the last things I did was send her a list of sober living homes, instead of making the calls for her or doing more to help her find a new place to move into. Of course, I've got hindsight with this, because after reading her journal, I realized things were a lot worse than I had initially realized there. But it was that fear of doing too much. And it's such a delicate balance. And there's no other situation where we tell families that they should not help, or that helping is wrong. Even in mental health, like, you know, there were times that she struggled with suicidal ideation as well. Family is a part of the recovery plan. Family is a part of the plan when they get out of the hospital. And family is encouraged to learn and support and help. And so I really, when people bring up enabling, like to talk about other conditions that somebody might experience where we wouldn't worry about enabling them, right? Like I had breast cancer a couple of years ago, and that could have been caused by my choice to take bioidentical hormone replacement therapy, lifestyle choices, my genetics, like so many different contributing factors. But nobody said to me, like, well, this is probably your fault and we're not going to support you. You need to figure this out. And when you figure it out, then we'll have a relationship. Right. Nobody, that would be crazy when nobody would ever do that. What was said to me was, I'm going to go to every single appointment with you and help you in any way that I can. But we're told the exact opposite when it comes to dealing with addiction. But studies show how important connection and community is as a part of recovery. And so when it comes to enabling, the the best thing that I find is kind of like thinking of it a different way, like over functioning versus under functioning, looking at ways that you're over functioning and your child or loved one is under functioning, and bringing your functioning down slowly so that they can increase their functioning. And if they don't increase their functioning, then they're going to feel the natural consequences of the things that they aren't doing for themselves, while also keeping safety in mind is a big part of that. And I think then when you think about it that way, then you've got something to work with. Then you're coming from a place of focusing on the solutions and coming from a place of love rather than coming from a place of fear and focusing on the problem.
Yes. And that can take over everything and make your decisions so different. And also, as you mentioned, the the ruptures in the relationship are huge. And I think that some of the ways that I understood some of those, if you want to say traditional or the common practices of tough love, of like everything's enabling it, that plays into the damage of the relationship. And it's already so difficult to learn how to interact with your child in this way or your loved one. And something I want to bring up, that invitation to change. So basically, from what I understand, tell me if I'm on the right path here, but invitation to change is a model that includes, from what I understand, craft, motivational interviewing, and acceptance and commitment therapy are kind of the three main modalities that go into understanding it. And something that you had mentioned about the enabling, what I found really interesting, and what most mental health professionals are trained on, behavior change. So we understand motivational interviewing, we understand the stages of change, but I feel like they're not applied to supporting someone with a loved one with substance use disorder. Because what's interesting is that when I started learning more about invitation to change, it was talking about reinforcing behavior. So instead of calling it enabling, what type of behavior are you reinforcing? Behavior that is, what they say is positive. So behaviors that you want to see that are towards change, towards recovery, or behaviors that are what they call negative, that are typically like dangerous behaviors. And so like, instead of, I really enjoy it. It felt so empowering to say, this isn't enabling or not. It's what can I do to support positive behavior change toward health, toward what they want to see in their own recovery. Like, that feels so empowering. That feels like a whole world has opened up. Whereas my understanding of enabling felt like I couldn't do anything and my world was closing in, and that it was all my fault. Everything that was happening with my child was my fault. And that sucks. And it's not true. Am I getting that right about?
Yeah, everything you said was right. It is invitation to change is based on motivational interviewing, craft, and acceptance and commitment therapy. And it is interesting how when it comes to addiction, like we just forget all of these things that apply to every other area of our life. And we really kind of also, in this tough love model, are forced to leave our values behind too, and our belief system. And so I like what you said about positive reinforcement as well. And then also another way of looking at it is like, what are you enabling? Because you can enable health and wellness as well. And the same thing could be enabling someone's substance use one day and enabling recovery the next day. Right. So there's no one size fits all black and white list of this is always enabling and this is never enabling. And that's where parents and other family members have to be empowered to make those decisions for themselves, because also they know their child better than anybody. They know what they respond to best. Right. Like my daughter did not respond to control at all. Some kids do, but it just pushed her further away. She just ran away and, rebelled in any way that she could, just caused more. It was like me throwing gas on the fire. But, like one example of something that is at one moment is enabling substance use and another day it's enabling recovery is like before my daughter went into rehab, I would not give her money. And I would always buy her food though. A lot of people would consider that enabling. But for me, that was a huge part of how we stayed connected. Those were those times that I treasured where I would go pick her up, take her to a drive-through and get to spend 20 quality minutes with her, hopefully that day. She knew that I would be there for her, or I could say, hey, I picked up some extra groceries today. Let me drop them off later. Right. It was a way that I connected with her. I prioritized that over anything else while still having the boundary of saying no to money. But then once she was in recovery, when she got to intensive outpatient and rent had to be paid and she had to pay for her own food, I paid for those things for the first month to give her a chance to find a job, and which she did, and she started taking care of herself. But in that case, I was enabling recovery by giving her money. So we have to really have what I love about the invitation to change and craft is they're both like a framework that give the power back to loved ones to make their own decisions from that framework. It doesn't say ever tell you should or shouldn't do this. It gives you a lot of powerful information to help you make empowered choices.
I really appreciate the emphasis on empowerment. And I know that in mental health, that's like a really, that's usually something that we're working towards. But what I found, especially in the early years of my son's addiction, was that the message that was probably the strongest in the professional community, and yes, I'm calling us out right here, and that's okay because we can only work with what we know, and a lot of people haven't directly experienced it like we have. But the common thread was that at a certain point, you have to wait until they're ready. And I often hear the hit rock bottom kind of thing, like do everything you can do to make sure they hit rock bottom, which was what I heard that message when I had a minor in my home, was that even just me letting my young 16-year-old in my house was contributing to his substance use. That did not vibe with me at all. And something that I've learned from doing this work and working with you and learning it is that I can make choices as a parent. That and you said something that has always stuck with me is that like we're the ones that have to live with it. And if I made a choice that didn't feel good for me, which at the time was being told to me to kick my 16-year-old son out of my home, that did not feel not only good to me, but it didn't feel safe. It didn't feel supportive of what he needed to maybe find a way to have less danger in his life. And so I'm just curious from your perspective of like from your own experience and also working with people, what you notice when you have this like empowerment to actually make choices that work for you and your family, even if other people, are thinking that you're contributing to the problem. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's really complex. I don't think it's ever as simple as kick them out on the streets. That's what's best. Right. And I hear people being told that to kick their minor kids out of the home all of the time. And it's devastating to me to hear that because homelessness does not make recovery easier. It actually makes it harder. So having a stable place to live is an important part of recovery. It causes parents to take advice that doesn't align with their values because of the fear and the desire to get them to rock bottom as fast as possible. Because there's also this thinking that rock bottom is this magical event that leads to lifelong recovery. And that's not true either. It's all a process. And even that belief that once somebody decides to go into recovery, that's it, it's over, they're just magically fixed, leaves families constantly feeling like, oh, their child or their loved one is doing something wrong because they're struggling in their recovery or they don't want it enough. That's another one of those things. You can really want it and also be struggling. But that desire to have your child hit rock bottom leads to a lot of like regretful behaviors. And like you said, nobody has to live with the consequences of taking the advice of other people but you. Like you're the only one that has to live with that. And I tell my clients that all the time because they feel so guilty and like they're doing something wrong if they don't take this extreme advice. And there is advice that I took that that I do regret, that I've had to forgive myself for. And I still have to keep working on that forgiveness piece because, the more perspective I have, the more I see how far from my values I was as a mom. But then that doesn't mean that it's always best for them to be in the home as well. Like my daughter wanted to move out when she was 18. I don't know if I could have actually what it would have taken for me to make the choice to ask her to move out, but she wanted to move out. And so I couldn't stop her anymore. And it was also what was best at the time because she was stealing from us and so many other things were happening at the time that once I started showing her more respect, right? Once I started using craft, like she started showing more respect to me and the family and respecting our home in ways that it's another thing that I think um, is a stigma that somebody who's in active addiction can't be respectful and they're always going to lie because there there was, that respect and that trust was restored both ways once I started treating her with respect and trust as well. But at the time, it was what was best for her to move out. But I also think that if a family gets in that situation, you don't have to just kick somebody out on the street. Like you can give them options, help them find other solutions. At one point, when my daughter had moved home after going to rehab once, it was the first time and she was really just struggling and she had some reoccurrence of use, things got pretty bad and it was dangerous to the family. And so I ended up giving her a choice. Like I would help her and support her to get to treatment again, or I would buy her a plane ticket back to a place where I knew that she had friends that she could make plans to live with and have something set up where she would be mostly safe. Right. I didn't just say, that's it, you're out on the street. And I think that all of all this advice that we give to people that is tough love doesn't give parents or other loved ones choices. They don't feel like you're either killing your child or by the things that you do by enabling them, or you've got to do something else that feels really wrong too. And it just makes it so much harder than it has to be.
Right. Yeah. And what's fascinating is that in motivational interviewing, which I took an entire semester of, options are the most important part of that modality. And it was made for people that were using substances, like working with ambivalence. Ambivalence is normal. And you wouldn't just tell someone in motivational interviewing, it's this way or the highway. It's constant. Here's some choices. What's right to you? What do you feel about that? What's good about your using? What's bad? So it's like, I feel like sometimes that gets at least for family members, the work that I got as a family member was opposite of motivational interviewing. I know that probably a lot of people use that in substance use treatment, so working with the person, but it just felt kind of like, um, yeah, it just didn't make sense and it didn't fit with the science. And that's another reason why I'm glad you mentioned that invitation to change and craft is science based. And I kind of want to talk just about a few more of the really important components of these models. And in craft, one of them that I think you were talking about is the positive communication. And when you said that when you and your daughter, like there was less fighting, there was more trust, there was more respect, can you share about what what you were using with craft that you think kind of contributed to that?
So, a big part of it is just before you get into using positive communication or anything like that, it's the spirit of it. It's the science and kindness approach, the loving approach that part of things had to change, right? The energy you're bringing to the relationship has to change before you can start implementing any of these things and then having that person respond well to it. So I really like to think about just the spirit of it, the kindness and the loving approach, and then implementing something like positive communication. And and that two-way street of respect and trust. And really before I got to positive communication, I needed to really even just understand boundaries and get back in touch with my own values. So there was a lot of groundwork that was happening at the same time that I was changing the way that I was talking to her. And a lot of what I was being told was like contracts, like, and that implied that I should have a sense of control, right? That I should be able to control another human's behavior. And with positive communication, it's more about collaboration and there's no blame. There's room for saying how you feel. And also, like, it puts you in the position of trying to understand the other person so that you can validate what they're saying or summarize what they're saying. It also puts you in changes your frame of thinking when you're talking to someone to really listen to them so that you're listening so that you can summarize what they're saying and validate what they're saying rather than listening so that you can come up with your next rebuttal to convince them that you're right and they're wrong, right? Like positive communication, is focused on the other person's boundaries too, right? Looking for their red lights and their green lights. A lot of like a contract or the other things that I was doing, I was constantly, she didn't deserve to have boundaries. She didn't deserve to have a moment where she didn't want to talk about things. And I would just fly through her red lights every time, which was like throwing gas on a fire. And then I would blame her for that as well. Everything was her fault, right? But when you get into learning about craft and invitation to change, you take personal responsibility for your part in everything, right? You're not owning more than you should, but you're taking responsibility for your part and focusing on what you can control and really giving the other person the respect that you would want in that situation as well.
Absolutely. And that makes sense that the relationship does change. And I think you said something really important. And I've noticed using it myself, just even in the few months that I wish I would have found it years ago. Obviously, I'm sure that you hear that a lot from
Yeah.
people that you work with, like, what? Like, oh my gosh, it's so supportive. But that being said, like, so you notice those changes in the relationship based on the way that you are um, approaching your part, I guess. And so what I think was the most frustrating for me was the convincing part. I always thought that if I had the best research or the best statement or the most emotionally charged, then they would see it. Then they would get it. It's like, but what was funny is that they would always say, I know this isn't good for me. I don't love it. I most of the time hate this. And I'm always trying to do, like, it's like what I was trying to convince them isn't some kind of like unknown thing that only I had access and information to. Like they had it too. And I think what makes me feel sad actually is that I really didn't understand and take the time to listen to their experience of it. I was just constantly trying to convince them to stop because it was scary and it makes sense. And I think that happens a lot. But like if I was thinking about the work I do with clients, I would never have a client if I did that. Like if I was just constantly arguing with someone and convincing them to like not feel the way they feel and that like just showing them research and evidence, like that would never work. So I find it interesting that for some reason, like I just kept on with that technique with my kids. And I'm sure you hear that a lot.
Yeah, and there's so much judgment in that. And, for myself, a lot of disgust at her behavior. Like, I just, it makes me a little nauseous to admit this, but I used to constantly say, like, what is wrong with you? Why are you doing this? And one of the things that I love about Invitation to Change is one of the sections is called Behaviors Make Sense. And that if someone's substance use was like putting your hand on a hot stove, then they would just stop. But it is solving a problem from them. And so we're asking the wrong question when we say, what's wrong with you? Right. The right question is, how does this make sense? And then we can come from a place of compassion and understanding. I didn't want to hear how it made sense to her, or because I didn't understand it. Right. It was only a problem. Nobody ever presented it to me as a solution to her problems. And so those thought shifts and the shifts that it causes in the relationship, in the conversation that it opens up, when you can say, so, what were you needing when you had that last reoccurrence of use, right? Is there something else that could have met that need for you instead of shaming and blaming?
And I've also been used to hearing language like relapse, language like, you know, they're clean when they're abstinent only sober, and different other kind of terms that, and I've noticed when I've entered into the world of Invitation to Change and craft, there's a lot of different language. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, they use person first language, which is used again in any other scenario, even with mental health. And so it's really, it leads to stigma. There's studies that show that when you describe, even to a doctor or some other professional, when you describe somebody as, and I don't like this word, but I'm just going to use it for the example, when you describe somebody as an addict versus somebody who has substance use disorder, they are thought of and treated completely different. And there's a lot of words that even I was using up until a year ago. And some of the words, like I still struggle with the word saying reoccurrence of use rather than relapse. Sometimes I have to be really intentional with my talking, but it's also really important to me because I realize how much my daughter's life was affected by stigma and how much my life has been affected by stigma. And if I don't stop and be really intentional with those words, then I'm just adding to the stigma unintentionally. And so, and that's the thing about it is stigma is so pervasive that it doesn't even feel like stigma. We wouldn't see it because it's just so common. So we've got to make this person first language common. We would never call somebody who has cancer a cancer, right? We know that that's an insult. We would never say that. But a lot of the language in Invitation to Change is focused on that, like a gentler way of looking at things, a more humanizing approach. Because that's the other thing, like when stigma comes into play and we're not using person first language, then we're labeling somebody as just that thing rather than that just being a part of what they're experiencing. And so it really limits our ability to even help that person, right? As a family member or as a professional. And so, like, imagine if I was calling my clients enablers, right? That would limit my ability to help them. It would just be a hard stop. And it's the same thing if I was thinking about their loved ones in those negative ways as well. So the way we think about the people that we're working with matters, because that's going to um, show in the way that we treat them. And then it's the same thing with our loved ones. The way that we think about them, that dictates our whole relationship with them and whether we're able to connect with them or not. When you're thinking all these really judgmental things and labeling somebody, it gets in the way of your connection. It just pushes them farther away from you.
Yeah, you said that so beautifully, talking about just how important that language is because of the feelings it brings up, the memory it brings up, and like what you said, how differently people are treated. And you also said how limiting it is. And this is going to lead me to our next point of the last something that I think is really important to talk about with this model is harm reduction. And when we limit our understanding of recovery to sobriety, do like abstinence only sobriety, which is honestly all that, and as you know, some people that is their recovery. Some people are abstinence only and that works for them and that's what they need. But what I love is the one size doesn't fit all and the harm reduction approach. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that because it's really been eye-opening for me of actually all the choices and paths that someone can choose for their own recovery.
Yeah, I didn't hear about harm reduction until my daughter was under house arrest for running away so much. And it was somebody in the court system that said those words to me for the first time. And it really opened up my world and it opened up my mind to something other than this abstinence only belief that kept me feeling like a failure and kept me projecting failure onto my daughter. So instead of being able to positively reinforce changes that she was making, those little steps that are really a crucial part of making a bigger change in your life, I ignored those because I didn't want to coddle her or enable her, right? And I was only going to reward the big thing, but we could never get to the big thing, right? So there was this sense of just ignoring all of the progress that she was making, the changes that she was making, and they were never good enough because she wasn't abstinent. And so it changed our experience by being able to celebrate those small wins, like passing a drug test. She had 2 drug tests a week and through the court system. And, initially my thought was like, well, big deal. You've got a lot more drug tests to pass, right? Instead of celebrating each one, positively reinforcing it, even with telling her that that's a big change and I'm proud of her. Just recognizing it and pointing it out to her as a positive would have been a positive reinforcement. So that opened up my mind. It opened up a sense of success for both of us. And it also has a big component that's focused on safety, because there's a lot of things with the rock bottom and tough love approach that aren't taking safety into consideration. Like a lot of parents think it's enabling to have Narcan in their home. Well, Narcan enables, saving somebody's life is what it really enables. And so the thought like it's okay to tell somebody to wear a seatbelt. We're not giving them permission to drive erratically or speed. We just want them to be safe, and thinking about harm reductions like Narcan in that same way. Like we're not giving permission. We're just prioritizing safety because somebody who isn't alive isn't able to recover anymore, right? Like, so it only makes sense. And the other part of it is it allows more connection, focusing on meeting somebody where they're at, seeing them as an individual human. And again, relating it back to breast cancer for me, like when I was going through my treatment, there were things that I didn't agree with, like my doctor's approach, things that I wanted to do my way because my quality of life was important to me. And nobody judged me for that. And people who are struggling with substances, deserve that same dignity to make those decisions in their treatment and how they want to find recovery. Not everybody has to go to treatment to find recovery, or they deserve to go through that process of maybe just going to meetings and seeing if that will work for them and going through that experimenting. And also, it's a huge commitment, right? I can't imagine having something that was such a huge part of my life and then just giving it up one day. Like, I think I would want to experiment along the way too, see if there's an easier way to do it, right? It would take a lot of work to build up the courage that it would take to make that huge commitment. And so that's another thing that I like about harm reduction too, is just allowing a person the dignity to make those decisions for themselves. And another part of that is medication assisted treatment. I think that if my daughter, she was on Suboxone, but she went off of it because nobody would sponsor her on it. And she felt there's, that you mentioned the clean and sober thing. A lot of, even in the recovery community, there's a lot of stigma. There's this belief that you're not fully abstinent or sober if you're taking medication assisted treatment. So nobody would sponsor her because of that. And she wanted to go off of it. And her doctor in the treatment center said he wouldn't take her off of it because her life depended on it. And she ended up tapering herself off of it. And it was only about a month or two later that she ended up passing away from that reoccurrence of use. So it that medication enables somebody to their brain to heal, right? Like there's all the science behind all of the brain chemistry, like somebody going through having to, they can't rely on those feel good chemicals that we have every day to get us through the day. But for some reason, we think they should be able to do it. And so I think harm reduction overall, it just humanizes the experience and makes it more like that person first, that getting rid of that one size fits all and allowing people the dignity to figure out what's best for them.
Yeah. And that is a huge concept. When you've mentioned the dignity, and like as a social worker, one of our code of ethics is the dignity and worth of a person, and that's like should be the first and foremost on our mind. Yet I think that when someone is in such a stigmatized space as substance use disorder, some of that dignity gets taken away because it's like it's like such a, I keep coming back to like how there's so much morality associated with substance use disorder. Like somehow you're a bad person, somehow you can't make these right choices, somehow you don't want it enough. And there's no other, if you want to say disease for the disease model, I cannot think of any other disease besides maybe some other mental illnesses where that would ever even be a thought in someone's head. And I know we can't talk about every single aspect of craft and invitation to change. And that's why I wanted to, before we go into our practice, a technique you're going to share, something that you can take away and either share with a client or try yourself, even if it's not someone working with substances. I think you can. I think a lot of this work, I have friends that use it with young children. I have people that say this is just helpful of how to like interact with humans in general. So I think that this information isn't just helpful for people that are loving someone with substance use disorder. But before that, I think a really great entryway into learning about this is your podcast. And like I've heard myself and other people in some of the Invitation to Change groups say that it's like a lifeline, and it truly is, because you cover so many topics, you have such great guests, but it really, I think, gives a really a comprehensive look at what this work is like. And I know that you have other methods that you've adapted in with it, but the spirit of craft is like so evident in the podcast episode. So I just want to make sure that we put that out as a resource for our listeners as a really great introduction. Or if you are someone who loves someone with substance use disorder, please listen to every episode, because I do all the time. I listen to one a day. They're very helpful, very supportive, because it's very lonely being where we are. I find it to be lonely. And so having that support through the podcast is like can be a lifeline for some. Um, and is there anything else you want to share about that? Or maybe we can just talk a little bit about some of the work that you do or how people can become engaged with learning more about craft or invitation to change?
Yeah, so the invitation to change, I have a free support group and it's just going to be ongoing. So it doesn't matter where we are in the learning process. And another thing that I love about the invitation to change support groups is that it is learning along with support, right? So it's not just support, which is really important, but it's also learning what you can do because, again, there's so little information out in the world about what you can do to really truly love and support someone. And I love the feeling of being in those meetings with a lot of parents who are interested in just treating their kids compassionately through this process and with respect. So I have a free invitation to change group. There's the Living with Your Child's Addiction podcast, which I'll get into the name of that in a minute when we do the exercise. And I also work with clients one-on-one.
And well said about marrying or coupling support with education. And for me, the support piece of this work is very important. Obviously, that's why Al Anon is so, can be such a great support for people or resource because there's so many meetings and Naranon, like you can go to those. But what I found with Invitation to Change and craft meetings and support group is that it's support and also a way that resonates in a way that's also, like you said, offering actual things to do and compassion for your child, your loved one, and compassion for yourself. That's something else I've really learned. And I know that the old school idea about codependency is like focus on yourself. It should be about you. Don't talk about your addict is what they all your qualifier, whatever it is words they're using. But I'm like, yeah, I think that's and true. It is like you said. I'm learning how to focus, but I'm not just focusing on myself. I'm like the compassion and the forgiveness and the softness and the tenderness was never introduced to me. It was almost like I was tough loving myself along with my child, and now it's like it's opened up this way of having open, curious, compassionate, and it is a journey, very hard work. I'm not going to say that it's not. But like I do think that when you said that, it's like it really does. It's almost hard when you're not doing it with your child to do it with yourself, and vice versa. So I love that opportunity and invitation, and we'll definitely have all the links in the show notes and stuff, and we'll make sure that we have those resources easily accessed to folks. But I'm really curious about the practice that you're going to share with us.
So one thing is that parents really struggle with is like aligning their tone of voice and body language and energy with the words that are coming out of their mouth. So, learning positive communication, a parent will spend a lot of time trying to craft a script and practice it and really be focused on trying to implement that. But then they feel so much resistance to their child's addiction that that's coming across in their tone of voice and in their body language and their energy. They're really closed off. And so our brains pick those things up, all those cues up before the words that come out of our mouth. And then the message is totally lost. It doesn't matter how amazing your words are. The only thing that's going to be picked up is that like unconscious signal that you're giving out. So I have this way you can work through that either with doing a meditation, or it can be done as a writing exercise. And that's by just taking a moment to sit with their addiction, because that's really what you're in resistance of, and giving it a face like an avatar. And picturing what that looks like in your mind or writing about what that looks like in your mind. For me, with my daughter, it was this little cartoon storm cloud, and it, was just angry, and it had like lightning bolts around it. And of course, nobody wants to be around that. But because it was a cartoon, because I gave it a face, and what's important about this is it's really hard to work through something that's not very well defined. And addiction's like this big bad thing, but it's undefined, like anxiety or overwhelm, right? There's not taking time to dig into what's happening there. So this process of giving it a face and trying to relate to it helps you live with it. And that's why I came up with the name of my podcast of Living with Your Child's Addiction, because it's like carrying grief. You have to learn to live with it. It's a marathon, not a sprint. It could be a lifelong process, right? And it's the same thing with carrying really intense grief. It's not that it ever is just going to go away. You just learn to carry it and live with it. And so it's that same concept for that name, Living with Addiction. And that's the same concept in this exercise, is learning to live with this, make friends with it, so to speak, give it a face. And so when I would think about this little cartoon like storm cloud, then I could soften how I was feeling towards it. And I could have some compassion for it, that how it must feel that nobody wants to be around it. And it has, being a cartoon, this childlike quality. And, which gives me like, I want to nurture it, right? Now I'm even more open to being around it. So getting really in touch and detailed with it, and right, being really intentional with how you want to think about that. And then feel it in your body, like what it feels like to be sitting there with that. See where you feel it in your body. And then that's also getting in touch with feeling your feelings and not just thinking them through all the time, not just analyzing everything, being okay with the discomfort, the sensations that come up in your body as you're sitting next to your child's addiction, even though you probably don't want to, knowing that you can tolerate that discomfort without adding suffering to it, that those feelings might be really uncomfortable, but they're not going to kill you. And just getting used to feeling that feeling in your body, so you don't have to have so much resistance to it, trapping it in there. And another part of the, once you've gone through that, is like maybe even, can you start building a relationship with this? Can you start being open to having it in your life? How are you going to live with it, right? Like, we don't try to change the weather. We work around it. We figure out how we're going to work it into our schedule, how this is going to work. So it's like this process of taking away the power from the addiction, taking away the fear from it, and just learning to sit with it without all that rigidity and all of that resistance, and having like warmth and curiosity and compassion.
Yes, I'm like feeling it as you're talking about that. And it sounds like that's such a beautiful exercise or practice that's also like I'm calling a practice, because I think that's something you would be working with, and like a way to what I'm hearing is externalize, because I think what happens a lot is that, same thing with person-centered language, the child is the quote addict, they are it. And you start to see you don't get to see their whole selves. And I got into that trap myself of only seeing the lying or the, sometimes the fighting or that type of behavior, like, and forgetting that, like, and my son used to say this to me all the time, like, there's so much more to me than my addiction. Like, can we please talk about something else? Like,
Yeah.
and I'm just like, oh my gosh, I cannot believe, like, what am I doing? And I think so. I think that practice really offers such a beautiful way of like being with it. And I think that really also speaks to the acceptance and commitment therapy piece of invitation to change, that it's like, it's sometimes radical to be with a reality situation, and it's painful, it's scary, but it's just there. There's not, you know what I'm saying? We don't have control over it. And that is a motto that goes across the board with all models of this. And I got a shirt the other day. I can't wait for you to see it. I got this shirt, and it says, it has the word tough love, and then it scratches out tough and has the word radical. And it said radical love. I honestly have been like keeping that in my mindset, that to really love and to radically love someone, it's painful. To love within all of that pain and fear, to me, is radical, and it's reality. You're accepting what is, and not having to shy away from it with anger or hatred or fear. I think it is truly, yeah, I think it's revolutionary, actually. For me, it is. What do you think? Am I getting a little too intense?
No, I was just thinking, like, there's radical acceptance, radical forgiveness. Why wouldn't there be radical love? I've also seen like love is tough enough, right? Like, when you're thinking about what love really is, and not the romantic version of it you see in movies, but real love, unconditional love, it has boundaries, and it says no sometimes, and it thinks about everybody in the situation and not just one person. So I love that.
Yeah. And that I don't know if I would have had the opportunity to really sink into such a radical space of love, have my children not had substance use disorder. And even though I used to, we've worked on this, I used to curse it all the time, like, it's the problem. If this was gone, everything would be okay. And like in that mindset, I wasn't seeing what was there, and opening up opportunities to still have connection and still have relationship and still be able to see that person as a human, no matter what stage they're in, whether it be recovery, whether it be active use. And so, yeah, that's such a gift. And again, thank you so much for sharing with us today. Thank you for the work that you do. There's got to be so many families and friends and loved ones that are experiencing this right as we speak, and just to have such a beautiful support. I think, I feel very passionate about it. I think it's just great work, and I appreciate you being here to share it with us today, and just being so open and real. It's a true gift.
Thank you. Thanks for shining a spotlight on it too, because it's more important to me than ever, I'm sure as well to you, to get this message out to more families so that they don't have to suffer without answers as long as we did.
All right. Thank you for joining us in this conversation today. Hope that you find it helpful. And also, please share, like, and subscribe and review and all of the things on whatever platform you are listening or watching this podcast. We'd really appreciate it. It really helps get the word out. And we'd also love to hear from you. Check out in our show notes how you can connect.